Welcome back. This is part 5 of this 5-part series, so this is the final one. I'm going to start talking about coding using the semiotic approach, and this will be sort of a recap of what I started with in session 1, but this time within the context of the site itself. So remember that we talked about how symbols or codes in communication govern how we make meaning. And that translates into semiotic relationships when you're talking about text together with other kinds of symbols like numbers, together with presentational symbols like iconography. And then when you add shape and order on top of that, you have these semiotic relationships. Codes enable us to process everything, but in the context of death and grief, remember we talked about like the color black, for example, the iconography and epitaphs, the rituals, all factor into those particular codes. And though they're situated in the time and space of creation, and we have to think about that, they may be interpreted in differing contexts of time and space. For example, how I would read this cemetery during the Jim Crow era versus the era of the Black Lives Matter movement might be very, very different, would be very, very different. And so we take that into consideration as well. So a contextual understanding of the area and its history, which we went over in part 4, would be necessary to read the material culture that expects social interaction. So let me say that one more time. This is material culture that expects social interaction. Even though these symbols are hidden away in the woods, there was an expectation of social interaction with those symbols, whether it was the same people returning to those places of memory or an understanding that people of later generations would come to that place of understanding and memory. So let's start with morphology. And just a recap of fieldstones. They were most commonly carved from limestone, sandstone, granite, slate, soapstone, and marble. In this case, it would be limestone, sandstone, and soapstone. These vernacular grave markers have no dates, no names. The time, money, and perseverance required to carve them would have been hard to find. And more importantly, those anti-literacy laws passed in the early 1830s that we talked about for African Americans would contribute to why the gravestones look this way. So these simple field stones vary in size from 6 inches in height to 15 inches, and they are set into rows. They've clearly been carved into square, mound, and pyramid shapes. And so you saw in the last slide, and I think I have it in the next slide, the pyramid-shaped or obelisk-shaped stone. This is another one. Now keep in mind, these are crude because carving them would not have been easy. So when we say obelisk or pyramid style, it's not going to be the formal styles that you would be accustomed to seeing in traditional cemeteries. This is an attempt at making that shape. So let's talk a little bit more about shape. So Rainville's work in Central Virginia's African American cemeteries revealed a pattern of stones resembling the form of Egyptian obelisks. So that's an ancient form that precedes Christianity. They were used to signal the entrance to temples. So according to Rainville, quote, enslaved African Americans were erecting stone stele that represented Egyptian obelisks before the form began to appear in white graveyards. So you see in this table that the majority, about 63% of the field stones, were carved into the obelisk form. And you can see that here in this photograph with the graveyard ivy. So the fieldstones sculpted into forms that resembled the Ethiopian stele found in northern Africa make those graves equivalent to signs that carry encoded messages. In other words, this is a text of this particular culture. So when the fieldstones function as signs, they function both as index and symbol, marking the location of remains while symbolizing the mound associated with the origin of the world in Egyptian cosmology. So that's one interpretation of shape. Moving on to size. This is a second way that material culture can function as a cultural text. So in public cemeteries, large towering gravestones, as I mentioned before, usually signify wealth. In this site, the tallest is no greater than 15 inches, while the smallest and the one most visibly carved in a pyramid shape is no higher than 4 inches. And you're going to see that in another video. The size of each stone indexes age, which was an assumption confirmed by a GPR reading of the ground that detailed the length of the remains. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute as well. Let me talk a little bit about order and direction. One more way that the stones can be read as cultural texts is by examining the order in which they're placed. So in linguistics, signs are encoded according to syntax. Here, order and direction functions in a similar semiotic way, working in tandem with the stones to encode a message about the afterlife. So this kind of analysis with order is really challenging in a densely wooded area where logging and clear cutting has taken place. So this is next to a paved road where the highway department is constantly clearing trees away from utility poles and utility lines. And so every time I go back, there are more trees. I mean, it's something that would have to constantly be cleared just because of its location. Prior to the site's clearing, they appeared to be randomly placed or ordered in circles. So at first, we thought they may have been ordered in circles, which is another custom dating to ancient Africa. But clearing the site showed us that trees that were much smaller in the 19th century, or maybe non-existent, had intersected the graves. And so some of them had rotted and fallen, some of them had grown up and moved the tombstones as they grew. So after we photographed them, we replanted them by raising them upright where we found them. But we did find that they appeared to be situated in rows, even though they were very crooked rows. Not those of a public cemetery, for example. So thinking about the semiotic relationship between placement and direction, the stones become signs indexing burial sites in rows facing east. And that's further confirmed by smaller footstones marking the end of the grave. This eastward direction suggests two symbolic possibilities. The first is that of a Christian burial custom, as bodies are buried facing the direction of the rising sun, where Christians believe Christ will return to reclaim his people. The second meaning for enslaved communities was that the deceased rested facing Africa. So because the stones had been moved or toppled by trees, the GPR scan was necessary to confirm the direction and order of the burials. The resulting computer imaging also adds an interesting dynamic to this study, because what we think about in an abstract form is made visual. It's given a visual form, which allows a conceptual world to enter a perceptual world. And quoting Wolff, 1999, it elongates the indexical link that's created. So in keeping with the allied disciplines of material culture method, I collaborated with physicist Rhett Herman from Radford University to read the site. So the unit that you see pictured here, it looks kind of like a push mower. It sends radio waves of 250 megahertz into the ground, where they bounce from organic material like wood or bone or blankets. Now this matter appears in contrast to the surrounding soil, and measuring the time it takes to go into the ground and come back from the object, the unit uses the frequencies to create images representing various intensities. So when this information is fed into, so you see that happening here. We mark what's called fiduciaries, and they bounce back and they show up in sort of these little mountain-like graphs. When this information is fed into a software program, tones or colors are matched with the frequency to make the burials visible. So here's an example of what it would look like on the computer once it's fed into the computer program. And these red ovals that you see are actual burials. And so we can look at order and arrangement, and we can also look at length of the remains to see if the size of the stone actually does index the deceased's age, and it appeared that it did. So these are just some pictures of us mapping the site first, creating that grid with flags and rope, assembling the machine, and then we ran the machine back and forth along these rows. And it's a challenge when you have lots of roots and you have stumps and things like that, because the machine cannot go over those. So he was concerned initially that we wouldn't be able to get a reading, but we actually did get some very good readings. So here's a video where I actually discuss this process in a little more detail.
So if you look straight ahead, you see the site here. We had to map this site with flags and rope, and then the machine that you see in the slideshow that looks like a lawnmower, you roll that machine along the rows that you map out, up, down, up, down, up, down, and the frequencies go into the ground, bounce back up, and the computer processes them as digital images. And so that's how we knew that the stones matched the remains underneath. And so that's how I was able to interpret why they were buried in the order that they were buried.
Again, you can see how we mapped it here, and we found that both adults and children were buried in this space. We found that the bodies were ordered east to west, and I explained what that meant. And we found a purposeful clustering. So Dr. Herman interpreted that based on his previous studies of mapping the cemeteries of enslaved communities. He interpreted that as probable family members being buried close together. So the images that emerge on the computer screen then become a new set of signs that index the burials from an omniscient point of view, rendered by the machine, top to bottom. So that allows interpretation of both size and order, but in a more specific way. So though computer technology radically improves what we're able to see, and I'm putting that in quotes, the results are still subjective. That means our interpretation of the images is based on what might have been or what we imagine could be true. So there are always gaps filled in by whoever is reconstructing this narrative, as well as those who study it. So I keep that in mind, and I say this, as I'm building this narrative, this story, it is what might have been in this collective memory space, where there was more to say than someone's status or someone's skin color would allow them to say. And so I'd like to quote Posner 2014 when he talks about something called a mentifact. A mentifact is an idea that governs a culture's use of artifact. So he says, and I'm quoting, "A society that seeks to find meaning in its monuments must therefore reconstruct their codes, determine their signifieds, and translate their messages into new texts related to new circumstances. The monuments of a society, therefore, like its rituals and its codes, carriers of a collective memory, which can always be reactivated depending on the demands of a changing circumstance," end quote. So how we read the semiosis of the stones and the images of the bodies affects us as carriers of a collective memory, particularly within the context of another racially charged era as this one has been. But it is also interesting, and that's a whole other study, to consider the burial site in the context of a present day pandemic, which may be my next course of action, is to think about the space, in particular a space where people were buried as a result of previous epidemics and pandemics, and what is said in that space and how we interpret that space in 2020. So again, it troubles as it inverts. It indexes a history that continues to cast a shadow on our nation over a century later. And this perpetual myth of racial innocence means that, you know, they could be forgotten, and the ivy-covered graveyard would be a powerful image for that particular memory, that myth, and the forgetting. But in the absence of traditional semantic symbols, the stones also represent a puzzle. So several signs came together to solve this puzzle, which we've talked about. And so then we say, if we decode these messages, we discover more than shape, size, and order. We discover a people communicating for survival the best way they could, even in death. And the stones create an everlasting cultural space signifying memory, family, and a history that may predate Christianity. And so I'd like to go back to a previous slide and let you see the remainder of this video that I made, where I talk about the site in just a little bit more detail and why I did this study. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to find the space where we left off.
So there's another one, still upright. So they were, when I looked at the order or the syntactics of the stones, we saw that they were indeed buried in a row. So if you see this row of stones, I don't know if you can tell, I'm going to walk up the row and show you. This one is really tiny. This index is the burial of a child. Just to give you some idea about the scale and the size here. Put my hand nearby. Very tiny. Again, chiseled into sort of a pyramid shape. There's another, and beyond that, another, and another. And we did find footstones for a couple of these. An example of a footstone, right? And so we know that they're facing east.
So I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining my seminar series. It's been a pleasure. I am happy to answer questions if you would like to email me. My email is aclark@virginia.edu. And thank you to Lakeisha Anderson and National Communication Association for giving me the opportunity to share my research this way. And I hope to be able to share more of it again in the future as I continue to do these kinds of studies.